Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. As you can see, we're still busy with the 16 crappy AGP cards that I bought for my Pentium 3 550MHz PC. The box is half full, so that means that we have already put lots of cards here on the test bench, and that is going to be the topic of this video. How do these cards perform on this Pentium 3 machine, the 550MHz gaming PC? So I've spent the last couple of days gathering data, playing some games, and seeing how the old Pentium 3 machine holds up with these AGP cards. Together with the VIA Apollo chipset, let's see what this gaming rig can do with these 16 AGP cards. And the first card we're going to be looking at is this RIVA TNT2 M64 Pro. So this is kind of a cut down version of the TNT2 that we see in, for example, the Diamond Viper 770. Now this is clearly an OEM card. It has a compact spare number, so this probably came from a compact machine. It does have a PWA 4000 marking on it, and so this appears to be the M64 version of the TNT2. Now this is a cheap budget version of the original TNT2. It has lower memory bandwidth and it will be slower in higher resolutions compared with this real TNT2 based chipset card, the Diamond Viper 770, that we're going to be using as kind of a reference card here. But let's start by looking at some specs real quick from this Viper 770 from Diamond. So what we have here is a RIVA TNT2 chipset with a 128-bit memory bus. Memory clocked at 150 MHz and the GPU clock set to 125, giving us 2.4 GB of bandwidth. And with the TNT2 M64, we have a 64-bit memory bus. And despite the fact that this reports a higher GPU clock and memory clock, the bandwidth will be significantly lower, which will give it a negative impact in higher resolutions. So although it does score nicely in lower resolutions in 3D Mark 99, giving it a comparable score to the original TNT2 card from Diamond, in lower resolution it clearly drops off a lot compared to the Diamond card. So here you can see the two cards head to head. You know, on certain benchmarks they perform the same, but in higher resolutions the Diamond V770 clearly has an advantage over the M64, making the M64 only suitable for low resolution games with low settings. So if we look at some other charts, we can see that the M64 behaves pretty good in 3D Mark 99, comparable with the Diamond card. If we look at Quake 3 with 16-bit colors, it actually holds up pretty well against the original Viper 770. Only at higher resolution it drops a little bit, but as soon as you bump up the resolution and go to 32-bit, you can see it is clearly dropping off quite a bit. It's not yet the slowest card of the bunch, we'll see that one later on, but it does perform pretty badly. Same story with expandable. In low resolution it is pretty okay, but as soon as you bump up the resolution and go to 32-bit, it drops off a lot. Compare this to the Diamond Viper 770 with a 128-bit address bus, and you can clearly see which one offers the better deal. Same thing with Unreal. On low resolution, it's pretty much CPU capped at around 40 FPS. None of the cards actually go beyond 40 FPS, but in higher resolutions, it does seem to drop off. So not really impressed with this one. These cards all around, you can pick them up for like $5 or something. I wouldn't really recommend it unless you don't have any other card. But I mean, there are obviously a lot of better alternatives to this one. Next up is a card from A-Bit, the Siluro T400 64MB AGP, boasting an Nvidia GeForce 2 MX400. Now this is a budget card from 2001, costing around $80 at the time. It was based off the original GeForce 2 MX. Now this is a budget card because This one has a slower SDR, a slower GPU clock, slower memory, and it has a slower 64-bit memory bus. But nonetheless, you can use older drivers on it, so it performs fairly well in Windows 98. Here you can see some statistics I cut from the Everest Home Edition. So GPU running at 200 megahertz, RAM running at 166 or 167 megahertz, but with a 64-bit address bus and SDR memory. But a fairly good card, as you will see in the benchmark figures. So now, because this is based off of an old GeForce 2, you can use pretty old drivers with it. For now, I'm going to be installing the Nvidia Detonator drivers 8.05, but you can go even a version earlier to the 7.76. Now, there are lots of versions of the Nvidia drivers for Windows 98, and you can go all the way up to something like 81.98 version of the driver, and it will work. I mean, it will install the display adapter in Windows 98, but your games will run slower because the overhead induced with these newer Nvidia drivers is something that our poor Pentium 3 CPU cannot really cover, and as such you will see big differences in games and in benchmarks between these different driver versions. Here I have three 3D Mark result sets loaded, and as you can see, the older drivers definitely perform better in lots of the benchmarks being executed here. But as far as 3D Mark results go, it isn't performing all that great. It is substantially slower than the TNT2 M64 we saw earlier, but I'm guessing this is more of a 3D Mark issue. Because if you look at the games like Quake 3, for example, you'll notice that it actually performs pretty well, a lot better than the TNT M64, even in higher resolutions and higher colors. It will also outperform the original Viper V770 that I had in this PC. And also in Expendable, for example, you see that it can keep up with the TNT2 card. Unreal, same thing. So overall, for this kind of computer, a Pentium 3 550 megahertz, this is a pretty decent card. Overall, I think this is a pretty good card to have in your little stash. It is common enough to find. I think even the 64-bit memory bus version will do, especially in a slower Pentium 3 based system like the one that I have here. Next up is a GeForce 4 MX440, a very popular and common budget card from Nvidia. Now this isn't a real MX440, but this is an MX440 SE. So this is kind of a cut down version of the original MX440. It does have a 128-bit memory bus according to Everest, which is good. And because we can use older drivers on this card, it should perform well. So here are some of the specs. Now this is detected as SDR memory running at 333 megahertz, which does seem a bit odd because I don't think that SDR memory is supposed to run at that speed. So this will probably be running at 166 megahertz instead. I do think that this is a 128-bit address bus. And comparing it with a real MX440, here you can see one with DDR memory, 128-bit memory bus, and a higher GPU clock and memory clock. Now again, as you see a lot with these kind of newer cards, quote unquote, is that they have really bad 3D Mark 99 scores. But when you look at actual games, for example, Quake 3 here, 16-bit colors, it does perform very well. Now the CPU is definitely a bottleneck here because none of the cards actually go beyond 60 frames per second in Quake 3 at this low resolution. So it's definitely capped on the CPU level. But the MX440 SE does perform very well, and also on higher resolutions because this card is able to use older drivers and it is more powerful than the MX400. It can keep up in Quake 3 in higher resolutions as well. I'm also not seeing a huge difference with the original MX440, the one with the 128-bit address bus. Expendable, like I already said, is probably one of those games that is really sensitive to the type of video card you have installed and the types of driver overhead that you have, because this MX440 SE uses a slightly higher Nvidia driver version than the MX400. It performs a little bit worse than the MX400. And with Unreal, it performs almost the same as the MX400. Basically, all of the cards are pretty much neck and neck here because this is going to be CPU bound as well. And now we've reached the worst video card in history, which is the Nvidia FX5200. And there were actually two of these MSI cards in this batch, boasting that FX5200 chipset. Has a lot of stickers here, so it's not always easy to find information on the card. But this is an HP part number, so this is definitely an OEM card. Like I said, this is nothing more than just a plain display adapter. It's not really meant to do any kind of, actual gaming. And there were some other FX5200 cards in this batch. For example, this one from ST Lab. It's pretty much the same thing, FX5200 chipset. It has 64 megabytes of memory, 64-bit memory bus. So yeah, nothing really special. These cards are basically all the same. Another variant here is this one from Sparkle. Again, same thing, 64 megabyte memory bus, FX5200 chipset. Now there will be some small differences in spec between all of these cards. Sometimes the GPU can be clocked a little bit slower or higher, but the main thing is that these are all 64-bit DDR based cards and they don't really perform all that well. Now you can find FX5200 cards with 128-bit memory bus, but in all honesty, I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It still remains a pretty bad card to have, especially in a system like this, where one, you have a CPU bound system with a Pentium 3, so you will be punished by using higher driver versions of Nvidia, which is something that you need to do when using these 5200 series. So all in all, it's a pretty bad video card to have. So time to look at some benchmarks. Again, 3D Mark 99, really bad score, but that's basically the case for all of these newer video cards. Here we have some results for Quake 3, 16-bit colors across 3 different resolutions. Yeah, it performs okay. When we move to 32-bit, it does hold its own, but then again, most of these newer video cards do. So yeah, I mean, in certain games, it will be okay. In Expendable, for example, because again, we're using newer versions of the video drivers, it behaves very poorly. And in Unreal, it performs okay-ish. So it's kind of a mixed bag, not really impressed with this card. So let's move on to the FX5700. So another card from the Nvidia FX series. Again, you need to have a higher Nvidia driver for this card. This one is 128-bit, so that is good. I actually have two of these. They look virtually identical, except for the fact that they have a different cooler and a slightly different version number, but other than that, they seem to be two identical cards. When looking at the benchmarks, again, we see a low 3D Mark 99 score for the FX5700. So that's pretty much in line with all of these newer cards. You can clearly see again that the TNT2 M64, the Viper, the Rage 128 Pro, these older cards really stand out. So I'm guessing this is a 3D Mark 99 issue. In Quake 3, 16-bit across all resolutions, the FX5700 performs very well on this Pentium 3, maxing out at around 60 FPS, which is good. In 32-bit color, we see pretty much the same thing, a slightly lower frames per second, 56 this time, but again, a really, really nice score. I'm beginning to repeat myself, but again, Expendable, the FX5700 doesn't perform all that well. In Unreal, it performs okay. And the final Nvidia card that we have here is a GeForce 6200 from around 2004, 2005. So a very late card to the game here, especially for our Pentium 3. It's not the best card, not even when it was released. It was meant for the entry-level kind of gaming market, but you know, at the time it was priced relatively low at around $150, but there were better alternatives from ATI around. Now, I did run into some compatibility issues with this card, and in particular the drivers which are needed for this card, which are pretty recent Nvidia drivers for Windows 98. I couldn't, for example, load up the specs here in Everest Home. It just crashed. It also had a very low 3D Mark score, like all of these newer cards. Quake 3 16-bit was okay. 32-bit also. So yeah, Expendable, same thing, new card, low score, and then Unreal, it was average. So yeah, not really impressed. And so we've arrived at the first ATI card, the Rage 128 Pro. Now that sounds impressive. Now the branding of this ATI card is a bit of a mess. You have the Rage Pro, Rage Fury, Fury Pro. So this one is in fact recognized as a Rage Fury Pro, so that sounds really impressive. But in reality, this is nothing more than a very business-oriented display adapter, something that you would find in a business PC. It's not really meant for 3D gaming. Internally, it is called the Expert 2000. So this is actually a Rage 128 design with a 64-bit memory interface. And this just goes to show how easy it is to get a hold of these kind of cut down versions of these cards, these kind of low cost OEM display adapters that bear some resemblance of the real thing, but only in name. You really need to look at the specs. For example, this card that I'm looking at here is an actual Rage 128 Pro, which performs a lot better than the card below because the original Rage 128 Pro has a 128-bit memory bus, giving it a memory bandwidth of over 2 gigabytes per second, which is not great, but it's not awful either. But when you look at this 64-bit variant, it barely covers 1 gigabyte per second in terms of memory transfer. So this is a pretty bad card. It kind of reminds me of the TNT M64 variant of the TNT2. So low cost, not really good at high resolution gaming, as we will see in the benchmarks. Now in terms of 3D Mark scores, they are pretty similar. It actually scores pretty well because the driver support in Windows 98 is pretty good. In Quake 3 16-bit, in lower resolutions, it's not all that great. It performs very bad. Also in higher resolutions, 32-bit, I'm not even going to mention because it just tanks completely. When playing Expendable, it performs relatively well, again due to the driver support. But again, compared to the original Rage 128 Pro, it doesn't perform all that well. Unreal is pretty much in line with the M64. So overall, not a great card to have. And if you're actually looking for a Rage 128 Pro, you better make sure that you find the real deal. The next ATI card we have is the Radeon 2950. Not really a gamer's card. This is again more of a fancy display adapter for people that like clean 2D images. They want to play DVDs or do like Photoshop stuff. This was never meant to be a gamer's card. Now in the 2D department, it doesn't fare all that well here because I got this kind of weird screen artifacts as I was moving my mouse around with this card. And it became even worse over time, so the more stuff that was on the desktop, the more it could kind of screw up your screen. So yeah, not really comforting. But then again, after installing the display drivers, I didn't seem to notice a whole lot of artifacts anymore, so not really sure what the deal is with this. So obviously, yeah, ATI drivers in Windows 98 are pretty decent. You can tweak a lot of stuff, as you can see. It didn't score all that well in 3D Mark 99, which is pretty much the case with all of these kind of newer cards in Windows 98 that should easily outperform these older cards. But I guess that certain benchmarks are really sensitive to drivers or are kind of optimized for these older cards. Same thing with expandable, for example. I wasn't able to get over an average of 25 frames per second with any of these newer cards, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, same story, low 3D Mark 99 score, okay-ish performance in Quake 3 at 16-bit color depth across all resolutions. In 32-bit it could hold its own, so it played in the same level as the FX5200, 5700. Expandable, again 25 frames per second. Unreal, it did okay. And the final card here is this Matrox G450 from the end of 2000. And unfortunately, I couldn't get this card up and running. It kept crashing in Windows 98, and at this point, I just couldn't be bothered with it anymore. Just to summarize, this is a pretty awful 3D card as well. It didn't really live up to its expectations, so there's not really much point in testing it and setting it against the other cards that we discussed here, so I'm just going to be leaving it at that for now. Now, because, you know, benchmarking all of these cards is pretty tedious, sometimes it's fun to throw in a little game, so I decided to test with Collin McRae Rally 2 and see how these cards would behave. And here you can see some metrics of Collin McRae Rally 2 in 1024 by 768 32-bit color. The TNT2 kind of lags behind because it is the oldest card. It did a lot better than the M64, which was unplayable, but the MX400, which has a 64-bit memory address bus, performs considerably better than the TNT2. Now, as we move to our first 128-bit card, which is the MX440, you can see that it has a considerably higher frame rate as the 64-bit memory card. So the MX440 performs very well. When compared, for example, to the FX5200, which is the 64-bit card, it is lagging behind despite the fact that it should be inherently a lot faster. I do have an FX5200 128-bit, and that performs considerably faster in these high resolutions at 32-bit. It performs pretty much the same as the FX5700, which is also a 128-bit card. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, one conclusion could be that, out of these 16 AGP cards, most of them are pretty crappy cards. Low-cost versions of existing cards, OEM cards, cut-down versions in 64-bit instead of 128-bit, lower clock GPU or memory clocks. So yeah, not the best breed of graphics cards out there, but they do provide an alternative to if you have like a standard display adapter in your Pentium 3 Windows 98 machine. I wasn't able to test all of them because these three don't fit in my Pentium 3 AGP slot, but I am going to be testing them in a more beefy system like an Athlon or something. But for now, I'm just going to enjoy the system a little bit, play some games because, like I said before, benchmarking is pretty tedious. I have lots of respect for people like, Phil's Computer Lab or Pixel Pipes or whoever's out there that's doing a lot of benchmarking. It's it is a lot of work, a lot of restarts, a lot of installations. It gets pretty tedious, but all in all, I think I learned a thing or two, so that's always nice. I hope to see you guys in a future video. The next video is probably going to be something more hardware oriented, so I'm a bit done with the whole benchmarking thing for now at least. I will be test driving these cards with an Athlon system as well because I already did most of that work. But for now, it's going to be back to business as usual, doing some hardware videos. And I hope to see you guys soon. If you like this video, please consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, and I hope to see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.